This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Daniel O'Brien, K-State grain economist, starts the show as he discusses what was in the recent prospective plantings and grain stocks reports and the effect they've had on the market. Keeping the show rolling are K-State Extension agronomists Tina Sullivan and Logan Simon as they chat about reminders for soybean planting and what is unique this year. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond in today's show as he recaps the recent precipitation and what weather pattern Kansans can be expecting. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with the grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Daniel, we've been mentioning for these past few weeks that the USDA's prospective plantings reports and stocks reports will be coming out March 31st, and as they have now come out, what are we seeing and how have they moved the markets?
Well, we saw higher than expected corn acres, and I guess prospective plantings for corn. Soybeans about where, corn had higher acres, soybean had lower acres than had been expected, and a number of other crops, ups and downs, lower grain sorghum acres than we had expected coming in, higher cotton, and so interesting to see that. And with regard to stocks, we didn't have many changes other than for U.S. corn. We had a record high number, the highest since I believe back in 1923. That's ever since they started keeping records. So that's indicative and a follow through from the large crop harvest we had in 2025. We've got that. At the same time, we really have pretty good usage going on, thankfully. So there's that issue. For soybeans, we had a 5-year high in stocks. For wheat, also a 5-year high. So from the stocks report, we got the message of abundant supplies that we're still working through from the 2025 harvests, with wheat included. And again, from the prospective plantings report, at least at this time, a higher number for corn, lower number for soybeans than we had thought. So, and when you look at the specifics, there was in that corn number a projection of 95.338 million acres of corn to be planted. The market was expecting about 94.3, so about 970 million acres more than had been expected by the trade coming in. And with that, we haven't seen the corn markets just, quote, crater, very, very scientific term, that it kind of drifted lower, but we haven't seen a 15, 20, 30 cent drop or anything like that. There is some expectation that that corn acreage number could decline off into the future, particularly when we get to the acreage report at the end of June coming up. Concerns about high fuel and fertilizer prices that might give farmers an economic incentive to cut back to something lower than the 95.3 million that was there. So we shall see. We won't see that acreage figure have much impact on the upcoming April 9th WASDE report, but when we add in the next marketing year to the USDA's numbers in their May 12th report, then yes, we'll see that. Well, I'm sure USDA, unless there's a major surprise, they'll plug in 95.3 million acres for plantings for 2026. They'll put a yield number on there, probably the 183 or thereabouts for what they'd had in what they put on from the USDA Ag Outlook Conference in late February, and we'll come up with 15.6, 15.8, something like that, billion bushels of corn projected, and we'll watch where weather takes us, planting progress takes us, and all from there. For the soybean number, again, a little bit lower than had been anticipated. Again, 84.7 million acres. That's just marginally above what the USDA had projected in the Outlook conference. We're about 3.5 million acres higher than last year for beans. So we 3.4 million acres less corn, 3.5 million acres more of soybeans. So you're just seeing these two bounce back and forth. But again, going back to the old adage, farmers will vote with their planters, and we'll see what finally happens. So weather, price expectations, all a number of other things, along with cost of production, profitability expectations, all will have a play in that. We also saw the all wheat number for the U.S. drop down to, in terms of prospective plantings, 43.8 million acres. That's down from 45.3 last year, about 1.6 million acres less. Winter wheat, 32.4 million acres, lower by about 300 some million bushels than the trade had expected. That's down about 740,000 acres less than what had been than what we'd had last year. So hard red spring acres, or pardon me, other spring wheat acres also down about 500 to 600,000 acres. Durum wheat also down. Go to cotton. Actually had seen the market that expected 9.2 million acres to be planted, ended up with 9.6. So seeing a switch in the southern areas of the U.S. towards higher cotton numbers. The sorghum number came in at 6.12 million acres. Market was expecting about 6.5. We were at 6.64 last year. So question's been asked, well, will that number shift around if we do see lower corn acres planted because of fertilizer and factors like that? Will we see some of those acres all go to soybeans in the central eastern corn belt, or will some of that switch, if it happens, come back to other crops in Kansas? Again, sorghum being the main one, along with soybeans. And so it's a possibility. I think if we do switch around on that, there'd have to be a change in profitability expectations. So there's a long story to be a long discussion to have with regard to why we're seeing these trends for these different crops in the state. But I think that'll all play out as we go. We also saw on some of the minor crops, canola, sunflowers here in Kansas, some pretty decent trends. Should go back to the hard red winter wheat acreage figure. So 2 years ago in Kansas, we had 7.6 million acres of hard red wheat having been seeded by the USDA numbers. Last year, 7.3. This year, coming in at 7. So strong downtrend. And you wonder why did we end up with that here in the state? I think when we were making those decisions last year, last fall, again for winter wheat, or coming into August, September, October, we just come out of a time frame when prices were at an almost a 45-degree angle down for most of 2025, and those price expectations note that downtrend no doubt influenced farmers' expectations and impacted their plantings. Since then, actually, for both sorghum and for wheat, we've seen some pretty good exports over these last several months for sorghum and for wheat. So we shall see what farmers decide to finally do here, both in Kansas and also around the country. So you got that. It closed yesterday for cash prices at for corn, 452 on the May contract, down about 2.25 cents. Had been as high here recently on the May contract as about 475 or so. So lost about 25 cents as we drifted a bit lower with again high stocks, record high stocks, and also the acreage figures. So the new crop D set 481, and when I look at cash prices there, you've got forward cash bids for corn, the strongest actually, Garden City area at 471, a 10 under basis. This would be for fall forward contracts. Next highest price, Pittsburgh, down southeast part of the state, one or two major bidders at about 456. Then prices generally lower than that elsewhere, numbered 437 in Salina, 439 Colby, etc. Some pretty strong forward contract bids also for for grain sorghum. The highest bid, 406 in the Colby area, 402 Salina area, Topeka at 402, some 397 Hutchinson, 391 Garden City. So not too bad a set of bids for grain sorghum. Soybean forward contract bids, all of them over $10, none of them to 11. Highest bids, 1089 in Hutchinson and Topeka, Saline area, 1084, Pittsburgh, 1084, 1064 in Garden City, and 1029 out in Colby. But Colby's a distance away from the processor, so it makes sense. And then for wheat, with wheat harvest not that far away from us, we've got the highest cash bids in central Kansas, central eastern Kansas locations, 591 at Salina, Hutchinson, Topeka. The best forward contract bids actually 605, 606 in those same locations. So harvest is approaching for wheat, and we've got these other commodities showing seasonality in terms of these moves. I guess I'd stand back from this week and see the impact of those reports. At least as we see to this point, we'll see where things close on Friday and for the rest of the day here. But overall, again, strong corn acres, weaker soybean acres. We'll see if that shifts around some by the time we actually get things planted, and be curious to watch over the next several months how the sorghum acreage and hard red winter wheat acreage numbers finally play out.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much, Shelby. Appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing soybean planting with K-State Extension agronomists Tina Sullivan and Logan Simon. Tina, Logan, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
Yes, thank you.
And before we hop into talking specifically about soybean planting, what's maybe a little abnormal this year?
When we kind of think about the temperatures we've been having, not just, the past month of March, but really this winter, it's been pretty mild, right? We've already hit a couple days of 90s, broke some pretty nice records in the western side of the state. It has been warm. It's also been it's been abnormally dry as well. But with those warm days and lack of wet soils to slow us down, we've had planters rolling across pretty substantial areas already putting corn and soybean in the ground. Think about soybeans. Soybeans have been the crop that maybe go ahead of corn. We used to think it went corn and soybean, but then soybeans were really the one we were putting in the ground first. It seemed as though we didn't have one of those hard freezes that it was going to be too bad of a worry. It can kind of sit there for a little bit compared to corn. Corn seed costs drive some of our decisions compared to soybean seed costs. But all in all, I was in the Northeast, so Donovan, Brown, and Atchison counties. They were rolling hard with planting soybeans, and then I was getting calls from the Leavenworth area, so Leavenworth County area, that they were rolling and putting soybeans in, and then in the Southeast yesterday, they've put soybeans in down there as well.
Any concerns with that?
I mean, some of this comes from we haven't had that late freeze in the last couple of years, and we kind of think about the historic last freeze for a lot of this area, such as the Southeast. Their last historic freeze date is April 4th, right? Yes, as we head towards the Northeast, yes, we're getting into more of that mid-April, late April period. But if we look at the long-term projections for weather, we're going to stay warm. We might have a little bit of a difficult, but also whether it's soybeans or corn that we're talking about, it really depends on where that growing point is. Soybeans can handle some cool temperatures in the soil. Depends if it would get up and then we get some kind of freak freeze.
So for soybeans, what planting dates do we see when we look around the state, though? Because as mentioned, we're maybe a little earlier than usual.
Usually when we think about soybean planting dates, we have these 4 general zones for soybean planting. And this is going to be separate than the maturity group for those. They're tied, but still. Some of the earliest beans can kind of be in this zone 2 to zone 4, and it depends if we want to go in early May to June. What kind of are we just doing full season beans? Are we doing something following wheat? We have a pretty wide range of beans, but there has been this push of getting beans in earlier and earlier, put a lot more vegetative growth on them because they are photoperiod sensitive. So if we get pretty tall plants, there's more of a potential because we have more nodes to get more flowers, potentially more yield. Also trying to move soybeans out of their seed fill during when we have less water and it's hotter. Then when we think about the maturity group, we can do 2s in the top corner of the Northwest, lots of 3s, lots of 4s, and then 5s in the deep Southeast. But even within the 2 to 5 range, we have partial, we can do a 3-7, a 4-2. That gives a little bit more flexibility with those soybeans as well. Planting date does affect which maturity group we go with. We have seen in research in eastern Kansas at the North Central site and at River Valley, whether you're planting a 3 or a 4, the early planting is always going to be more beneficial than a late planting for either of them. The late planting of a later bean is going to be pretty steep on that yield decrease as well. They just don't have enough season because that day length they don't have enough day length to get that vegetative growth up before they swap over to reproductive, even if they are indeterminate beans.
Logan, how does water and moisture play a factor in all this?
Water really drives a lot of this conversation around soybean planting. And honestly, for those areas that have had moisture, we may even find ourselves in some places where we get these big showers being at a point of excess moisture if we're wanting to plant here right now. That really drives our decision making. Now that we've got some moisture in some of these places, we're probably in a good place over in the eastern part of the state to roll through from a moisture standpoint. But especially as we think about moving west in the state, it's important for us to consider the distribution of our rainfall along with our night and day temperatures and how that dynamic influences our flowering and grain fill in this crop as well. And so we've got moisture over east to establish potentially a good crop. Out west, we are dry, we are typically dry. And so, especially in these areas, we get more consistent production going a little bit later. And so in those places, we tend to see a lot more beans go in that late May, early June timeframe, just due to what our averages are. And especially getting into central and western Kansas, especially in the central part of the state, that corridor, we will likely still hold off in a lot of those areas versus the folks east of the Flint Hills that have really ramped up on planting with all this moisture.
And there's been research done at K-State of how early can we put beans in, and even in our research plots, we have not been hit with a cold yet, right? That would have been detrimental because I know at the Kansas River Valley site, late March, he had rolled and put beans in. So we're following with the times and seeing what it does. I think we're just one real good cold snap away from realizing maybe we put beans in too soon.
As soybean growers are rolling into their fields for planting, is there something that you ever see them accidentally forget, or maybe new research that's come along that you'd like to share with them?
It's going to be a little bit less on the research side, but just remembering to protect our seeds, right? Some see it as a insurance. We usually run an e-update about inoculation or seed treatments, but just we might be dry right now. If the beans are going to have to sit there though for a little bit because maybe they're waiting on moisture, it's not the right temperatures, we leave those soybean seeds pretty exposed to the elements, so to speak, even if they're below ground, but we're leaving them exposed to more diseases and actual insects, right? So warmer temperatures usually means we have more insect pressure earlier in the season. But again, last year we've seen a lot of seedling diseases because of how wet we were. Just because we're dry this year doesn't quite mean we are fully out of those windows for some kind of soybean seedling disease. Because if we get a well-timed rain and the seeds have been sitting there, we don't always have that same level of protection either.
Are you concerned about diseases and insects as we look forward?
All I'm saying is if the soil temp, we're in the right soil temperature range, right? But if the beans sit there for a little too long, we are leaving seed for more opportunity for something to happen to it.
What do you consider too long?
There's so many factors going into what does mean it's been sitting there too long, right? We usually don't want to be planting, leaving it there for weeks at a time because soybeans should be germinating 6 to 10 days after they've been planted, right? But maybe it was really dry, or we had another one of these weird yo-yo temperatures, right? Not saying it fully affects, but dry soils play a different role compared to wet soils.
Anything else you'd be encouraging soybean producers to be keeping in mind right now?
Some things for folks to think about as they are going out with beans right now, especially if we are in a part of the state that's still just a little closer to 50 degrees and not as close to that 55 or 60 in parts of southern Kansas. It is really important that we are going out with a good seed treatment, fungicide, insecticide to protect these plants. We've got really good products out there. They are commonplace, and this will be one of those years where we are going out really early, and it's just a good insurance policy to have out there as we're rolling the dice on a very early bean here in 2026.
Logan, Tina, I appreciate both taking the time to join us today.
Of course, Shelby.
Thank you so much.
Those were Kansas State University Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan as they discussed soybean planting. If you would like to read more on this topic, there are a few agronomy eUpdate articles, which I will link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. However, the first one is titled Spring Planting in Kansas, Soil Temperature and Moisture Status. The second one is titled Soybean Row Spacing and Seeding Rates, What Works Best in Kansas, and the third one is titled Soybean Planting Date and Maturity Group Selection for Kansas. As I did mention, they will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find them for yourself also by going to eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Once again, that is eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. While you are there, you can subscribe to get their weekly e-news email updates. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Kansas State University's meteorologist Chip Redmond as he shares what he has seen this past week for Kansas weather and what we can be expecting as we take a look ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Chip, we have started off April, but first, wanting to take a look back at March, and when we do, did we set any records for the month?
Yeah, probably the most notable record that we set in the state was the warmest temperature recorded in March in Kansas history. We had multiple readings of over 100 degrees last Saturday in southwest Kansas, just ahead of a cold front where we were seeing what we call a torching effect, which is basically really strong warm air pushing up ahead of that cold front, and that resulted in a couple of 104s in the southwest. That breaks the old record by quite a bit. The old record was about 101, so to break any high record temperature for a month period by 3 degrees, that's a big deal, and just really impressive heat. We've got a lot of dry conditions. Even more impressive, we think that just only about 5 or 6 days before that region was in the single digits with an impressive but brief cold snap for the region.
And recently, parts of Kansas saw some precipitation. So who got rain, who didn't get rain?
Yeah, so I was really hoping this rain event would trend a little bit further west, and initially it looked pretty optimistic that it would happen, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. We ended up with rain focused mostly in the south and east. We saw totals up to 2 to 3 inches of rain in southeast Kansas, We've had some pretty persistent drought conditions for that region, and that 2 to 3 inches was much needed. But as you get further west, the amounts tapered off. I'd say from about a Barber County line north and east to about Cloud County was the definitive cutoff where there was no moisture at all to the west of there. And that's an area that's been rapidly growing with drought conditions. We had a big expansion this week in the drought monitor, added about 10% of the state into at least some sort of drought category, including abnormally dry conditions. So now 80% of the state is abnormally dry. And then we also saw the first introduction of extreme drought in far northwest Kansas and Cheyenne County. That's the first extreme drought we've seen in the state since back in October of 2024. So, we really need some moisture to come further west instead of, it kind of keeps hitting the same areas. That I-35 corridor has been the hot spot, and it just seems to be trending. They keep hitting the same locations again and again and again.
Are we going to continue to have moisture, and what are temperatures going to look like?
We're in an active pattern right now with another system coming through here on Friday night into Saturday morning. That's going to bring another shot of storms, but mainly, again, far east Kansas preferred. I just don't think we'll get much in the way of precipitation further west, as that front's just coming through a little too quick. Temperatures going to be pretty normal. Highs in the 60s and lows around in the mid 30s. That's pretty average for this time of the year. Through the weekend, we will have some breezy northwest winds, but we start to warm things up later in the weekend, early next week, and we get multiple cold fronts again, and we're getting that pattern back that we had a couple of weeks ago. We get these dry cold fronts that push through 1 or 2 a week. However, the precipitation is going to be pretty minimal with those, and we have to look really to next weekend. So we're talking around the 11th, 12th of April to perhaps get the next bigger storm system into the region that might bring some moisture. I think while we didn't get rain with this most recent event everywhere in the state, what did happen is we got rain in Oklahoma and Texas. Those areas are in really bad drought. And by putting some moisture in the soil, it opens the door for potentially bringing that Gulf moisture northward a little bit better. It doesn't get evaporated as much as it moves northward. That will hopefully allow for the next system, maybe next weekend, to maybe bring some of that Gulf moisture further west and further north into the region and hopefully relieve some of these recent dry conditions. I see just some optimism of keeping an active pattern at the very least, starting again next weekend. So spring's here. I think we're going to get spring moisture. Hopefully we can get enough to offset these drought conditions.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.